Good morning and welcome everyone to another CEO information sharing session. It's the first one of this year. We were caught by a surprise last week Friday when the Department of Employment and Labour announced the national minimum wage increase for this year. So very excited to be discussing it today with our National Collective Bargaining Coordinator, Mr. Daniel van der Merwe. Daniel, welcome.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the discussion of that, I just wanted to state for everyone tuning in, for those who haven't tuned in yet, this will be recorded, will be available. We are streaming live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. And for those who missed this session, they can obviously then view it afterwards on those platforms. I just want to encourage any people viewing to join in on the discussion via the comments section today. So we will be taking questions, feedback, remarks, anything that you guys want to share your mind on. We would love to discuss it, to hear what everyone has to say, especially employers and business owners alike. The purpose of today is obviously to address the announcement, to ask, what is the increase? What does it impact? How does it impact employers and businesses? And maybe even possibly vent a bit of frustration from, what the economy point of view is, especially given the state of South Africa at this stage with all the increases. Historically, the reasoning behind this increase is justifiable, but practically and how it's implemented, up for debate. And on that note, Daniel, I would like you to just walk us through what is the increase, where did it come about, how is it implemented this year? And if you can just walk us through an overview, please.
Thanks, Paul. Afternoon, everyone. I think obviously quite a big topic, and to just purely put it onto one slide and call it an overview is to a point doing it an injustice. But I think, especially given the ramifications that it has for the economy, it obviously has quite a big impact. But I think when we talk about the topic of national minimum wage, it's obviously got quite a long history within South Africa. And I think it was in 2018 or 2019, the beginning of 2019, when it was formally gazetted and introduced as legislation with the 20 Rand an hour. The minimum wage is something that causes a bit of controversy every year, especially from an employers' organization point of view. It's something that, when we discuss it internally as well, is something that causes a bit of friction in the office, because we know and understand the impact that it has on employers, especially long-term, given the state of the economy, given the state of the labor market at the moment. But I think if we'd really just delve into the fundamentals of the national minimum wage in terms of how it's going to affect employers going forward, I think let's start with context. I like quite a bit of context before just jumping into the discussion. So a lot of employers out there, CEO members would have noted that during the year, especially towards the end of the year, usually around about September, and then in December again, CEO asks for commentary in terms of the national minimum wage. And the reason for this is the Department of Employment and Labour, through the National Minimum Wage Commission, publish reports. And the first report that usually comes out in about September of each year is basically quite a lengthy document that talks about where the economy is, what's impacting the economy, things like inflation, load shedding, all those words that we just bombarded with every day, and that we know have a big impact on our lives. And then it gives opportunity to employers to provide their commentary on it, to say from the employer's perspective, what they're experiencing, how they experience those particular aspects, and what it means for their business going forward. Once that commentary has been submitted, the National Minimum Wage Commission sits once more, and they then compile their recommendations. And those recommendations are then subject to public comment once more. And following that commentary process, it gets submitted to the minister, and the minister then makes his decision or her decision, as has been the case now last week, Friday. So just a bit of background in terms of the process. CEO, we always try and submit extensive commentary on this because we know it obviously has quite far-reaching effects on the economy and for most of our members as well. And I think for us, what's really important is always between striking the balance of where we need to go as a country, obviously keeping in mind the impact or the economic conditions for people that earn a minimum wage, the cost of living crisis, but then obviously the most important factor is the employers. Without employers, you wouldn't have employment to start with. So it's important that that's obviously sustainable going forward.
Sorry, Daniel, it's definitely a double-edged sword in that regard. I mean, historically, South Africa has one of the lowest minimum wages, across the globe. I was looking at the statistics, the stats about a month ago, just on that. But On the other side of the fence, we also have to put implementation practical effect within our state of the economy. And on that note, increasing it every year with inflation, with interest rate hikes, it becomes almost unbearable for some employers. So, I mean, we're also there to fight for those employers, for all employers on that regard, to see where we can strike the best balance between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also has to be borne in mind with, for instance, like the unemployment rate in South Africa at the moment, especially if you look at youth unemployment as well. These numbers are sky high, and they obviously pose a real problem and a real threat to the economy going forward. So if we look at perhaps like last year, for instance, there was an increase of about 9.6% on the national minimum wage, obviously well above inflation at that point in time. That brought it to an amount of 25.42. The latest increase is now, if we work it out exactly, it's 8.49 something, but rounded off to 8.5, which will then bring the national minimum wage currently as at 1st March to 27 Rand 58. And importantly is obviously this extends beyond just the national minimum wage, but goes to domestic workers and to farm workers as well. Historically, farm workers were always a bit below the national minimum wage a few years back, but that's obviously been increased quite significantly, and you'll see in one of the lower points in terms of the overview, I talk about this and the impact that has on the economy and inflation and things like that as well. So quite a big increase. I think also, just to put it into perspective, COVID, I think it was the 2021 increase, that was only about 3.8%. Obviously, that was very circumstantial at the time. But if you look at the increases over the past few years, the curve is quite a sharp curve compared to inflation. I think just the last point on this as well is the National Minimum Wage Commission also published the medium-term targets in terms of what the national minimum wage should be or what it should look like going forward. And that was very closely related to prevailing CPI. So obviously 8.5% compared to the prevailing CPI is quite a lot higher, but nonetheless, some of the recommendations that were made in the last round of commentary to or from the Commission were almost a bit higher than 8.5 as well. So it seems that, obviously without seeing the reasons, it seems maybe there was due consideration, if any, or a little bit at least, for the big increase compared to last year.
And the national minimum wage affects the majority of employers in South Africa. I mean, obviously, if you employ a general workforce and you're not in a specific sector, you're looking at applying a national minimum wage across the board there. So, this is significant effects across the South African economy for majority of employers, especially maybe your smaller employers or your SMEs. So I mean, from your side, what do employers, or let me ask this, what can employers do if they can't afford the national minimum wage?
Look, so before answering the question, obviously, especially if you look at SMMEs, it's not just the economy as a whole that's a challenge. Obviously there's load shedding to contend with, there's fuel prices, there's just so many challenges. And when you add this into the mix, you can understand how, obviously being a business owner or being an employer in this country, sometimes being confident and being positive is a bit difficult. And I think what's also important to remember as well is when we think of an 8.5% increase, we tend to think that an 8.5% increase is generally quite a linear type of thing, whereas there are employers out there that offer, for instance, the Provident Fund or some kind of extra benefit over and above just the minimum wage. And that obviously has a bit of a snowball effect into that as well. In coming back to your question, I know Wesley Field, our manager from our Bloemfontein region, will be sending out an article shortly in terms of how businesses can tackle the increase in the minimum wage, and I encourage people to look out for that. It's quite informative. But a very practical solution or a practical option is the national minimum wage does allow for exemptions to be applied for. I know it's something that's not very commonly done. Even from our point of view, we've seen very few, if any, employers applying for exemption. I remember even at one stage when we filed commentary on the minimum wage, asking for statistics from the Commission of how many employers have actually applied for exemption and how many have been granted, because that's always for me the key one, is how many have been granted. And I remember, I think to this day, we still haven't got a response on that, but nonetheless, it is an option that is available. Whether it's successful or not, you'll never know until you've tried, I suppose. But I think it is something that we always want to encourage employers to maintain employees. We need employment in the country. And if it's an option that potentially provides a lifeline, then it's something that should and hopefully can be explored. Again, whether it's successful or not, I think case by case scenario, but it is nonetheless an option available.
Yeah, and that's obviously a tool for employers that genuinely can't pay or afford, and then obviously that exemption is then lowered to the amount that they can afford for their business to be sustainable, and also looking to fight the effects of retrenchment, which I'm sure a lot of retrenchments will happen this year again because of the increase.
Yeah. Speaking of retrenchments as well, I thought one of the topics that keeps on coming up, especially when providing commentary all the time, is that if you raise the national minimum wage, it's just going to directly lead to retrenchments. And what's quite interesting to note is, doing quite a lot of study on this particular aspect is there's no clear link between raising minimum wage and retrenchment. But on the flip side, there's also no clear link between that and obviously employment going up at the same time. So what you see is the minimum wage constantly being raised, and the unemployment rate within the country, while it does obviously move within a certain bracket, the unemployment rate still remaining excessively high. And I mean, we spoke earlier, when we look at minimum wage rates across the world and internationally, our unemployment rate is also incredibly high internationally as well. So while there's a strong argument to be made that it doesn't, or that it will affect unemployment or employment for that matter, the correlating evidence shows that it doesn't exactly have a positive impact on employment. And naturally, obviously, if you increase input costs, your output's going to go up as well.
And I think for many businesses, they just have to, well, it is what it is. The wage has been increased, so South Africans must make a plan, unfortunately. And that's just, I think, the mentality across South Africa at this stage as well. Is, we make a plan as employers. If you are struggling, please feel free to reach out to us, that we can offer assistance or advice where possible. But sorry, Daniel, I digress here.
Yeah, so in terms of that as well, if we go on to the next point, in terms of the farming and agricultural sector, I mentioned it earlier, this sector has obviously seen quite a significant increase over the past few years. And this is obviously one of the areas where inflation can grow. It's rough in terms of inflation being affected. And that's because obviously food, where the food comes from, and obviously fuel prices going in there, load shedding as well. And then you go and add this big increase in terms of labor input costs to agriculture, obviously has quite a big effect down the line as well. And if I remember correctly, agriculture, I think it was in the last round of commentary, not the current round, had taken quite a big hit in terms of employment and employment numbers. But obviously that is a seasonal thing. And it's obviously also circumstantial in that particular period of time as well. I think what's important sorry, Carl, just let me on that one is what happens every year as well. What we've noticed is when they publish the new national minimum wage, the wholesale and retail sector gets published at the same time. Obviously quite a big sector within the economy. We try and provide commentary on it as well in terms of the national minimum wage being determined. But last year as well, we got the question so many times, where do I find the wholesale and retail sector new rates and things like that? And you'll find it in this particular gazette as well.
Which is a bit odd, considering the other sectoral determinations are not published with the gazette.
Yeah, what's interesting to note as well is obviously your general worker, if you can call it that, in terms of the wholesale and retail sector, obviously they get the national minimum wage as well. So there is that correlation between
100%. Okay. I see. If we have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments so we can address them. Even if there are questions, maybe after the fact, that when we're not live anymore and you watch this video, please feel free to drop a comment. We will obviously then respond and get back to you with an answer there. Daniel, I don't know if there's anything more from your side on this.
There's one more thing from our side, and I'm obviously quite biased towards this point, being in collective bargaining. But an interesting trend that we're starting to pick up is with the national minimum wage increase kind of being, I don't want to say unpredictable, but without knowing exactly what the rate will be for the increase in terms of the national minimum wage, it's potentially posing one or two problems in terms of collective bargaining. So if you look at the private security industry or the metals industry, for instance, and you look at what the equivalent minimum wage would be there, as opposed to where the minimum wage is moving or the national minimum wage is moving, it seems that at some point the two might cross and the national minimum wage might be higher than what the collective agreements are making provision for. And it hasn't happened at this point in time yet, but it seems as if it carries on this current trajectory, it could have that potential impact in the future. There's all sorts of arguments that can be raised there in terms of would it be undermining collective bargaining and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, there is that argument. But at the end of the day, your minimum wage is your minimum standard, and it's something that will have to be complied with. But it could also just have then that knock-on or snowball effect into other industries going forward as well.
I think in our idealist view, in an ideal world, you know, the increase is a really good thing across the board for, you know, employees and promoting employment and all of that. But as I said earlier, the balance and the practical effect in South Africa is that it's not always sustainable. And we see that with a lot of businesses closing shop or retrenching. And as you said, there's no direct correlation or that we've proven yet, but there's also no correlation to unemployment going down. So, you know, it's one of those unfortunate things. And, you know, employers have to obviously comply with this, otherwise we run into issues on that side. But for those who are really struggling, like I say, please feel free to reach out to CEO for advice, for help, and we will obviously do our best to assist where possible. Daniel, I see there aren't any comments or questions or feedback coming through yet, but possibly we can address those after the fact when people are watching this video.
Okay. I think just then the last thing from our side, Carl, is as I mentioned, the Gazette obviously makes provision for minimum wage, domestic workers, and farm workers. The last one, or the last group of employees that it makes provision for, is for anyone in the construction or civil engineering industry that deals with expanded public works programs. There has also been obviously that rate adjusted as well, and that current rate at the moment is 15 Rand 16 per hour. So anyone familiar with that particular expanded public works program, there's also been an increase in that regard as well.
Just a thought for myself, if I was an employer and I was looking for a place or, you know, to find this document or the Government Gazette detailing the increases, where would, you know, I be able to find that? Has CEO posted it on that post, or?
We have posted it, and I'm sure we'll refer to it again in, like I mentioned, Wesley will issue or has an article written for this particular subject, and I'm sure we can post it in there. But if not, simple just a Google search on Gazette notices, and you will find it there.
Silly question, but people always ask, you know, where do I find this information? It's one thing to talk about it, another thing to see it. All right, Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I think that is pretty much everything we've addressed and that we had scheduled to address. Like I said, if there are any comments that come through, I'll just redirect them to myself and you, and we can then get back to everyone. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in, and please stay tuned for other hot topic updates. As they come, we'll schedule them and we'll then address them live. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Daniel.